मसाले तो बहुत हैं, पर प्रकृति की गोद से खास चुने मसाले जिनकी ताजगी, खुशबू और स्वाद रहे बरकरार, ऐसे उम्दा मसाले बनाते हैं सिर्फ कैच। कैच का कोई मैच नहीं, 100%।
Hello and welcome to a power-packed day at the Times Literature Festival. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, better known as Veer Savarkar, continues to uniquely influence India's political scenario decades after his death. In this session, historian Vikram Sampath will bring to light the life and works of Savarkar, one of the most contentious political thinkers and leaders of the 20th century. In conversation with him is award-winning journalist, radio television personality, and founder of Pickle Jar, Vasanthi Hariprakash. Stay tuned.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿರುವಂಥ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ. And as was being mentioned, always a good thing in the post-COVID world to actually see people in the flesh and face to face. We are going to make the best of this evening, with someone who has spent a considerable time researching a man who remains a mystery despite so much of public debate going on. Vikram Sampath, how many years now have you spent?
Just 5. Just 5 years.
5 years. That is, as you were saying, an entire term of the government. That is really, in an academic pursuit, quite a bit of time to devote to the biography of a man who, to many of us Indians, was unknown or undiscovered, so to speak, as we were growing up. So the topic, Vikram, is the mystery of Savarkar, which means that there is an assumed sort of intent here to unravel that mystery, and that's exactly how I, as the moderator today, is going to look at this entire time we spend. So I am going to therefore leave it to you to introduce to us Vinayak Damodar Savarkar as you have known him.
Wow, that's a tall order. A very good evening, everyone, and thank you to the Times Lit Fest, to Brookfield Properties for hosting us. As Vasanthi said, it's so wonderful to get back to these spaces where there is live interaction with people. We're so bored of those Zoom calls and those rectangular boxes in which so many pigeonholes fitted with people screaming their heads off. So we'd rather scream our head off from the stage here. It's been a culmination of a long journey, as Vasanthi mentioned, about 5 years, trying to demystify or understand or wrap my head around this man who's been a bundle of contradictions. But then, as you mentioned, Vasanthi, the problem with this person is someone who all his life fought for the abolition of untouchability, unfortunately and ironically has become a political and social untouchable, someone who's an outcast, about whom discussions too are considered anathema. He's a persona non grata, so to say, in Indian public discourse. But at the same time, I can think of very few characters of the past who intrude our contemporary space, our politics, our rallies, our election manifestos in the manner that Savarkar does. We all know how almost every election rally or so, Mr. Rahul Gandhi would mock him, for which there would be a defamation suit filed by Savarkar's grandnephew against him. The Prime Minister goes to cellular jail and offers his obeisances to him there because Savarkar was incarcerated there for 14 long years. You have the Rajasthan government, the Chhattisgarh government spending valuable time debating whether we should prefix his name with that adjective Veer or not. And raucous news debates every night on television channels. Every now and then he keeps resurfacing. An election manifesto of a political party decides whether or not we should give him the Bharat Ratna. There is a controversy around that. So he's so much in your face, though he died way back in 1966. But if any young person today wants to actually read about this man and understand what is this noise all about, the last comprehensive biography of Savarkar was written when he was alive in the 1960s by this man called Dhananjay Keer. Now, since then and now, it's taken 60 years for somebody to actually make sense of this man who was a voracious writer, a very sensitive poet, a playwright, a journalist, also a fiery orator, numerous dimensions to this man. But while history as a discipline is something that involves revisiting, reevaluating people and characters of the past routinely, almost every second year, we have some biography or the other, and rightly so, of people like Mahatma Gandhi or Nehru or Subhash Chandra Bose these days and all of that. Somehow Savarkar escaped that historical reevaluation and yet was so relevant.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that, Vikram. So I'm also wanting to, for both of us to start from a place of this word and this term that is often taken together in the same breath as of Savarkar, which is of Hindutva. Though Savarkar was not the man who coined the word, we know that it was not by him, yet he is identified as a proponent of Hindutva, on which of course he wrote a lot. But I want us to start with that journey of that word, how it was when he used it, and now when it has probably gone far beyond what he intended it to be. Yeah. So how do you look at that, first of all?
This is again another controversy subject right now. Hinduism is different from Hindutva, and while Hinduism is very egalitarian, Hindutva is very narrow, sectarian. That is the normal, popular narrative that is going around, and every second day there's a news channel debate for which I'm called and which I refuse to go. But then to my mind, these two words, at least etymologically, mean the same, because Hinduism, we are a nation where we cannot judge our faiths, our culture, our customs by a Western lens, where everything is unilaterally clubbed together by a ism. And most often, these isms that were denoted, there was something that was seemed as inferior to the mainstream Abrahamic faiths. Judaism, though it's an Abrahamic faith, it is considered to be always inferior to, we know the anti-Semitic persecution of the Jews and so on. So it was only in the 1830s where the British first coined this word Hinduism as a group of people who did not belong to the Muslim community or the Parsi or the Christian or everyone else was clubbed as this. And about 60 years later, in 1892, we had the first use of the term in Bengali by this gentleman called Chandranath Boshu, who wrote a book in Bengali on Hindutva. And that's when this term Hindutva, and the suffix twa that is used in our Indian languages, is the state of being, the essence. So Nari, Naritva, Purusha, Purushatva. So similarly, if you're a Hindu, it's Hindutva. Your essence or the state of being a Hindu was what, and it's the same as Hinduism. So etymologically, these two words actually mean the same, what is in English and what is in Indian languages, Sanskrit or anything else. But what Savarkar did to it was, I think, carried forward the tradition which several people like Swami Dayanand Saraswati or Maharshi Aurobindo or even Swami Vivekananda did to infuse that Hindutva term with a sense of resistance, with a sense that while we are an egalitarian religion, while we believe in that, dictum of ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti, and there's just multiple paths to the same truth and all that, when you are faced with theologies which do not subscribe to this egalitarianism, which are talking about my way or the highway, that there is only one book, one messenger, one God, and anybody who does not belong to that clique is an infidel who is rightfully to be admonished or suppressed or killed or converted and all of that. In such a scenario, and also at a time in India when there were secessionist movements which were coming up, which eventually succeeded in vivisecting the nation, the subcontinent, into two countries based on religion, there was a necessity for a force, for a movement to actually put that view across of resistance, of thus far and no further. And so the political arm of Hindutva, as Savarkar propounded it, became that very vehicle, where he time and again also emphasized that this has nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hinduism, of the journey of the soul, super soul, all those esoteric terms, but it's more a sense of consolidation among the community itself. And to do that, Hindutva invariably would also become a vehicle or tool for social reforms. Because you cannot consolidate unless you remove the barriers that separated the Hindus, which was mainly the caste system and different evils like untouchability and so on. So Hindutva, according to me, and as how Savarkar probably saw it, had these dual roles. One as a resistive force and also as a modernizing force. Just as you had reformations in Hindu society right from the times of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and the whole Bengal Renaissance, similarly, you had this movement which strove all the time for removal of boundaries between people, bringing the Hindus together in a united force. And time again, Savarkar also postulated, as the president of the All India Hindu Mahasabha, like what was my concept, his concept of a Hindu Rashtra. The Hindu Rashtra, which is shown as this behemoth which is going to gobble up all the minorities and so on. He says time and again that in, not quoting his exact words, but the sum and substance being, in his conception of this Hindu Rashtra was a nation where everybody was equal in the eyes of the law. There was no concept of a majority and minority. The majority, which were the Hindus, would not get any concessions or extra privileges only because they were more in number, and likewise the minority would not get any extra concessions because
so it is more
less.
of a social, cultural identity than a religious identity, is what,
exactly.
what you would
and
argue.
so the very tags of majority, minority would not exist. Your faith is your personal space. In your house, you do what you want, but don't bring that to the public realm. And in fact, he says in one of his speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha that the minorities of India need not even have a ghost of suspicion in their minds that the Hindu Rashtra will do anything to infringe upon their legitimate political, social, cultural, or linguistic rights. So everybody being equal in the eyes of the law. What else is the definition of secularism? What else is the definition of the universalism that Sanatan Dharma actually propounded? So I think the misrepresentation that is done of these terms for contemporary political expediencies, I think that is really, really unfortunate.
So Vikram, one is the aim and intent with which Savarkar propounded the Hindutva theory as he saw, which you have explained. But the other part is also, I mean, part of the unraveling of the mystery of Savarkar as we set out to do here is also, how much did he have even the Hindu orthodoxy with him who could have carried forward that vision, given that in your own book here you have argued about Savarkar's crusade that he took literally to all the schools to get children of the untouchable caste into the schools, to actually eliminate, the caste system in the Hindu society, and to actually take on some of those enemies who were when I say enemies among the Hindu orthodoxy, who put out a stiff resistance to Savarkar's own attempts to reform Hinduism. So that is I'm placing it at one place. There's also the second element, which really intrigues me, which is that we have Mahatma Gandhi on one side, where his own views on the Varna, the caste system, are now, much known. There is new material. The fact that he, in fact, believed, in it and did not really challenge it in that sense. There is this one paragraph, for example, where Ambedkar himself quotes it from his Gujarati journal, Navjeevan of 1921-22, where he quotes Gandhi. And he says that about this thing, quote, says Mr. Gandhi, I believe that if Hindu society has been able to stand, it is because it is founded on the caste system. The seeds of Swaraj are to be found in the caste system. Different castes are like different sections of military division, and each division is working for the good of the whole. And he kind of goes on to argue that. Whereas, on the other hand, we have Savarkar who's trying to challenge this, and he's himself an atheist. His views on cow worship, which now, of course, the right wing has, made its views very, very much known. And when it's, let's say, taking over Savarkar's appropriation, as I would see it, in fact, there is such a dichotomy in the views of Savarkar with RSS, Savarkar with the Mahatma at that point of time, and yet, and in fact, even when he dies, before that he has willed it that there will be no Hindu rites performed, and he's cremated in an electric crematorium. So we have this absolutely rational man, pragmatic approach to Hinduism per se, as opposed to Gandhi. But this man is seen right now in the lens of the 21st century as the Hinduism conservative, whereas, Mahatma Gandhi is seen as, let's say, the moderate one. So how do you explain this building of public opinion and how Savarkar is viewed now?
Yeah. See, these labels are very interesting, and how you put labels on people or groups then also go to determine subconsciously how you view those people. All through in our history books, we kept hearing about the two factions within the Congress, the moderates and the extremists, right? I mean, the moderates, immediately any child also is told about the moderates, the face of probably Gopal Krishna Gokhale comes up in your mind's eye. And extremists, it's Bal Gangadhar Tilak, right? And then revolutionaries, who our books even to this day call as terrorists. People like Bhagat Singh or Shurjo Sen and others, who in Delhi University textbooks and so on, to this day they are termed as terrorists. So these labels that we put of liberal, of nationalist, of moderate, because being moderate is an aspirational goal. Who would not like to be moderate? So it's almost subconsciously you're made to feel that this is the icon you're supposed to live up to. But if you just flip that tag and actually call the moderates as loyalists, and the extremists as nationalists, which what they were, then a completely different story perhaps comes through. Because a lot of what the moderates were actually being very, collaboratory with the British government. They wanted some concessions, and at many occasions in my first volume, I also talk about how people in the moderate faction were actually leaking out secrets about the revolutionaries to the British government, actually acting as spies for them, for which many of the revolutionaries actually wanted to get them killed. So these labels are so complicated, but then once in our country, I think once you put a label on somebody, oh, this is communal, this is conservative, very regressive, whereas something else is modern, I think there's no debate further, because nobody would like to or aspire to become communal and conservative. You would always want to be liberal and modern and egalitarian. But then the facts speak completely differently. As you rightly mentioned, the Gandhi-Savarkar paradox. Today, as you said, the so-called right wing or whatever wants this whole campaign on the cow protection. But that was what Gandhi also wanted, right? I mean, he also went on fasts and hunger strikes and so on to protect the life of the cow. So did Acharya Vinoba Bhave and others. Whereas Savarkar said, I don't consider the cow as being worthy of worship. Of course, that didn't mean that he advocated slaughter of the cow, which is again a misrepresentation that people do. He said, I don't consider an animal that sits in its own squalor as being worthy of being elevated to divinity. If you want to worship it in your house, please do it. But don't bring it into public space, so much so that if there is a balance between the life of a human being and an animal, the life of the human being, and more than that, if the national honor is in question, then that should take precedence over a cow. And he cites so many cases that Krishna was also called Gopala, someone who protected the cow. So protect the cow, but don't worship it, was his rationale. And time again, the cow was used as this shield by the invading forces so that the Hindu armies would not fight back and so on. So these were his very strong opinions about that. But then he also said if the cow is being slaughtered only to spite the Hindus, as was done, then that should be opposed. So those nuances one must also see. But what you rightly said, I mean, someone who advocated a complete elimination of the caste, a totally, casteless society, somebody who started the first ever intercaste dining cafe in India in the 1930s in Ratnagiri, at a time when even among the Maharashtrians, the Deshasthas and the Chitpavans would not sit together and eat, though they were both Brahmins. At that time, to have a Mahar, a Maratha, Brahmin, and all the other communities, right to the lowest order, sit together and eat was a huge, huge step, which probably is very difficult to achieve even today. The first temple in India, called the Patit Pavan Mandir, which was established in 1931, which allowed access to people of all castes for communal worship as Hindus and not as Brahmins or whatever else that they had, was started by Savarkar in Ratnagiri. Intercaste dining, intercaste marriage, a free access to the Vedic literature, which he said is universal knowledge. It is not the preserve of just the Brahmin community or one particular group. So if it is the Yagyopaveet which is preventing people to access the Vedic literature, let's democratize it and let everybody get the Janevu and let everyone access the Vedas. So ideally speaking, when I was doing my research, he should have been the poster boy of the so-called liberals today, right? I mean, all these aspects which talk about a free society, an open society, someone who stood for modern science and technology. In 1934, when the earthquake hit Bihar, it was Mahatma Gandhi who very famously said, I think this is God's curse to us for implementing or continuing the caste system. And that's why we were rocked by an earthquake. And so Savarkar took him to shreds in his Shraddhanand, of which he was the editor, saying even if someone who is so enlightened like Gandhi is resorting to such superstitions, that God is sitting somewhere angrily cursing everybody for having a caste system, what to speak of the common masses? You need to have a scientific temper. At the same time, he says in that article that the Shankaracharya is saying that the earthquake has happened because we are trying to dismantle the caste system, and Gandhiji is saying the earthquake has happened because we are perpetuating the caste system. So God is really confused somewhere as to why he is causing this earthquake. So somebody like this who had that rational sense of mind and scientific temper, as I said, he should be the poster boy of liberalism and secularism too, as I propounded just before, that everybody is equal in the eyes of the law, and all your faiths, whether it's the cow or it's whatever, you don't do the namaz in the streets. Similarly, you don't bring your cow worship to such an extent that it's going to interfere in public policy. And the maximum amount of outrage and backlash that Savarkar faced, other than the Congress, was from the orthodoxy within the Hindu society.
Yeah, that's
Wherever
exactly what
went,
I was referring to.
He had, murderous attacks made on him, stones thrown at him to kill him, and black flags waved at him everywhere, which he kind of faced and survived.
Now, one of the things which is, again, part of the mystery of the construct of Savarkar is that when we look at his treatise on the 1857 War of Independence. In fact, I think he was the one who gave it a certain elevation, and other than what it was called the mutiny otherwise. So, which I think all of us kind of take for granted. And that positioning, I think, was very interesting. But here is a man who propounds Hindu-Muslim unity in that space, or in that time of his life, and then moves on to become the father of Hindutva, which clearly is seen as very divisive, as very secessionist or extremist for sure. So what happened, Vikram, in between? If you can give the, let's say, a crunched story of Savarkar between this time and the time when he was in cellular jail and when he came out to Ratnagiri. So,
yeah, that's a very interesting question, because as you rightly said, he was the one who coined the word, the first war of Indian independence, which was hitherto disparagingly called, a sepoy mutiny, just a few random chaps who threw some bombs and then the British made do with them. But then he stayed in London. He was a law student in London for 5 years. And in those 5 years, 2 years he spent in the British archives using the British documents to actually use it against them. to write this treatise. And in that, very interestingly, he actually castigates even someone like a Hindu Maharaja like the Scindia, Jayaji Rao Scindia, who is castigated by him as a coward, a traitor, a cobra, and all of that for betraying Rani Lakshmi Bai, which is part of folklore that the Scindia actually ensured Lakshmi Bai's failure. But then Savarkar has great things to say about Bahadur Shah Zafar, about so many other Muslim leaders of the 1857 uprising. And in fact, he was very good. He ends that book on a Urdu ghazal. And Savarkar himself also wrote ghazals in Urdu, which were discovered from his cellular jail times, and some of them have been even set to music and sung by people, all patriotic themes. But I think what happened in those 10, 12 years in cellular jail was something that changed the man, probably made him more aware of the realities of Indian society. One was the atrocities in the jail itself, where I think the British policy of divide and rule ensured that most of the jamadars, the wardens of the jail, were all Pathans from the Northwest Frontier Province and Punjab and so on, who particularly were very, very cruel with the Hindu, inmates. And they were not allowed to carry any symbol of their religion, whether it's a tilak or it's a, sacred thread, or do their, pujas, whereas the Muslim prisoners were allowed to. And the treatment in cellular jail was so inhuman, even the basic human rights not being given to most of them, of food and water and toilet facilities and medical treatment. And in such harsh circumstances, many of the prisoners were given the option that if you convert to Islam, then we will reduce your punishment. And so obviously in such harsh things, instead of Rama, you say Allah, you just get a less flogging or better food to eat. Many of them would cross over, not with the conviction of the conversion of mind, but as an expediency of the moment. So, but then to get them back into the Hindu fold, there was no mechanism, because we are not a proselytizing faith. So then he employs first the Arya Samaj technique of, Shuddhi, which is reconversion back into the parental fold of most of these people, much to the, again, backlash of the Hindu prisoners who did not want to accept those who had left the fold. But I think the turning point, more than that, came with Gandhi's launch of this very, very dangerous movement, which I've always called as one of the seeds of partition being sown there, and also the time when the seeds of religion and politics in a very pernicious way entered, which was the Khilafat movement. The wordplay again is very important. I'll keep stressing on that. Khilafat, it's called in such a way that anybody who listens to this will feel it's Angrezon ke khilaf abhiyan. But that was not the Angrezon ke khilaf abhiyan, but it was a movement to establish the caliphate, pandering to pan-Islamist sentiments at a time. So for those whose history might have gotten a bit rusty, at the end of the First World War, you had Turkey, which had lost to Britain, and the British wanted to, and the people of Turkey were fed up of this caliph, who was a very despotic man there. But then, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk came to power in Turkey. But then Gandhi and the Congress then used this movement to galvanize support among the Muslims of India, saying because they considered the caliph as being someone very, as a successor of the Prophet and so on, you needed to, we'll help you to re-establish the caliphate in Turkey in return for your participation in the non-cooperation movement. So premium being put to the citizens of this country, saying we will help you establish how does establishment of a caliphate in distant Turkey have any relevance to the Muslims of this country who are suffering as much of the tortures of the British colonialism? And isn't this a movement which is logically flawed and doomed to failure right from the word start? Because we were a slave nation. So here are some people raising jhandas and saying, put the caliph back. The British are not obliged to, give in to your demand. But then they were promised that. And Gandhi also went on to promise that within 1 year, we will establish the caliphate and we will also give you Swaraj, complete Swaraj. Now, neither of it happened. Obviously, the Swaraj not coming to us did not matter so much, but the dismantling of the caliphate movement ensured that mobs and carnages happened all through the 1920s. You had the Mopla carnage in Malabar, of which we are commemorating 100 years now in 1921. And all through the 1920s, you had numerous genocides, particularly against the Hindu community. Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj was assassinated by Abdul Rashid in 1926. And for all of this, the response of the Congress, particularly Gandhi, was very, very pusillanimous. When Abdul Rashid assassinates Swami Shraddhanand, Gandhiji calls him my dear brother Abdul Rashid. I do not even consider him as an assassin. We must get into the psyche of the assassin to know why he picked up the gun. It's the blame is on us Hindus to introspect and so on. Similarly, the Moplas, the irony is in 1926, Swami Shraddhanand was assassinated. And 20 years later, sadly, Gandhiji himself was assassinated by Nathuram Godse in a heinous act of assassination. But then Gandhi's followers did not consider my dear brother Godse. Let's get into his psyche to understand why did Godse actually, assassinate Gandhi. But on the contrary, congressmen went on a rampage, killing Maharashtrian Brahmins across the state of Maharashtra. And Godse's statement too was banned. What he gave in court, it was only in the 1970s that it came out in the public opinion, public space.
When on Gandhi's assassination, because that had such a profound impact on how Savarkar is viewed today, because he was accused as a co-conspirator. The commissions found, or rather absolved him of guilt. But somehow the political discourse, let's say Savarkar could never escape to this day, and has not been able to escape that shadow of the Mahatma's assassination charge. Vikram, so two questions here. One is that, when you're trying to understand Savarkar very objectively, would you think that it was in fact like I had asked in my previous question, someone who actually had looked at the need for Hindu-Muslim unity when he began, and then things took a course in the cellular jail, as you said, and when he came out, if it were not for what he called as a Congress's appeasement or the double standard in applying to Hindus versus Muslims, Savarkar would have been, would have been, I don't know whether to call him a moderate or something like that, but he would not have been pushed to the fringes of the Hindu.
Interestingly, Vasanthi, when he comes out of confinement, so after 14 years of cellular jail and which included 3 years in Indian jails, 14 years of hardcore imprisonment, and 13 years of house confinement in Ratnagiri. So 27 years of his life, prime period of his life, went away in confinement.
And starting from the age of 28,
yes,
when he was 28.
Yes, 28 onwards. So when he came out in 1937, the Congress was actually bending over backwards to have him in their party. So there was a public reception in Bombay where there are messages which I quote right from Nehru to Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was the president of the Congress then, saying, I hope you will join the Congress.
Is Rahul Gandhi aware of this?
Well. So Raj Gopalachari, whose message was there, including him in that message saying I'd written a biography of Savarkar, which caused a lot of consternation. So there was so much of admiration for the man. But then Savarkar is supposed to have said that I would rather be in the last row of the patriots than in the first row of traitors. And he considered the Congress as being treacherous to the nation because they had gone way too far in the path of Muslim appeasement, according to him. And it was not perhaps too far from facts, because right from the Morley-Minto reforms, the separate electorates that were given, and then the communal award, which the Congress too was a party of and party to and agreed to, where separatism was encouraged, and this Khilafat movement, which actually fueled that whole pan-Islamism and kind of a universal ummah kind of sentiment, and that we are different. We are someone who need to be concerned so much with extra-territorial allegiances rather than the concerns of this own country, which is why in his Hindutva, he defined a Hindu by not religious terms, but in cultural and nationalistic terms, saying anybody who lives between the Sindhu River, the Indus and the ocean, who considers this land as the land of his forefathers, or Pitrubhumi, and also holy land, or Punya Bhumi, not in terms of religion, but in terms of your loyalty, terms of your allegiance, he or she would be termed as a Hindu, culturally and nationally, not necessarily religiously. So you could be a Muslim, Jain, Parsi, Christian, whatever, in your house, but culturally you are Hindu. And Vasanthi, I mean, even if you see, say, an Indonesia today, which is a Muslim majority country, but their national ballet is the Ram Leela, where there is an acknowledgement that by faith I am a Muslim, but by my cultural roots, Ram is my, someone I look up as a civilizational hero. So when Indonesia does that, why is it so difficult in India, where in the confines of your home, you can have multiple identities. You have a cultural identity to yourself, but you have a religious identity, which I mean, an Indonesian Muslim is no less pure just by the fact that he or she participates in a Ram Leela ballet. The very acknowledgement that this belongs to my forefathers, I think that cultural association and that because the Muslims of India too did not come from Arab, right? The contemporary Muslims who are there today, their forefathers belong to this land. Either they voluntarily changed their faith, or they were induced either through coercion or inducement or whatever to change their faith, and that's how it's happened. But the stock
I think
goes back to the same.
One of the things that really needs to be discussed here is the way we today look at people who are multifaceted political freedom fighters or figures through a very, single lens and not acknowledging, whatever because it is, I mean, every human being is really a complex set of attitudes and views, but we somehow don't seem to acknowledge this. I often think of this scenario where when Bhagat Singh, in the case of Bhagat Singh, he was defended, and Bhagat Singh, who today is seen by many as, let's say, Marxist communist, defended by Lala Lajpat Rai, who was, again, seen as a Hindu nationalist. But I think back in those days, it was a rather organic, let's say, struggle where people did not really care about whether I'm seen as a nationalist, communist, Marxist, or something like that. Yeah. But on the other hand, we tend to see them as sort of unidimensional. Yeah, so has that done a disservice to somebody like Savarkar and, of course, many other freedom fighters and important political figures? Because look at even Hitler or Pol Pot. I mean, even they have their own, let's say, biographers. But it really is surprising that
who are not
Savarkar,
called names.
What's that again?
Who are not called names. Biographers who are not called names.
All right, you have said that in your defense. Now, I just, is there a reason, or is it because of the shadow of the assassination charge, you think, that Savarkar's name did not figure even among the, let's say, the revolutionaries? Otherwise, we did read about Aurobindo, Bhagat Singh, not as much as we should have, but it was not like, there was a total absence of names. The fact that Savarkar was completely left out, and there's a parallel question to this. Now, when he passed away, Indira Gandhi hailed him for his courage and daring. She had released a stamp in the name of Savarkar. So there was a time and place in our contemporary history where even the Congress did not show such animosity towards the memory of Savarkar. But then her own grandson in today's time, and also her own partymen who opposed the statue of Savarkar in the parliamentary hall. So what do you think changed between Indira Gandhi and the Congress of the 90s?
Yeah. So to your first question, it was someone none less than Jawaharlal Nehru who, in one of his books, I think Glimpses of World History, in the 1930s, he mentions that there's a very thin line separating Indian nationalism and Hindu nationalism. The two actually converge at some place. So the very fact that in those times, so how would we today evaluate a Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who in his Anand Mat actually envisaged India as Bharat Mata, an iconography of a mother. Similarly, Aurobindo, who also, or Vivekananda, who also spoke of the motherland in a very, very Hindu iconographic way. Are they all to be treated by these same yardsticks of being communal today? And their role or their philosophy has no role to play in the secularized, sanitized version of our freedom struggle. I think that's deeply problematic because then you excise and actually have very few characters left whom we can venerate. A lot of the revolutionaries, including someone like a Sachindranath Sanyal or even Chandrasekhar Azad was a practicing Brahmin in Banaras and places like that. So they may be revolutionaries, but they carried their faith on their sleeve. The famous picture of Chandrasekhar Azad twirling his mustache also has him wearing his sacred thread. It's not as if he gave that away just to become a freedom fighter. So the two actually it could coexist so peacefully then. But I think today, in the times when nuance is dead, where everybody has to be boxed into these Zoom pigeonholes, where you are for the debate, against the debate, for the debate, against the debate, binaries only exist, where no sense of nuanced discussion can happen on anybody or anything. You are either with us or you're against us. That is the Bushism that rules all of us, in which several people, particularly Savarkar, become fall guys. And you rightly pointed out, I think one of the reasons is his whole implication in the Gandhi assassination. Sardar Patel had a very telling letter which he wrote to Shama Prasad Mukherjee, who was earlier with Savarkar, then joined Nehru's interim government. And Shama Prasad Mukherjee wrote to him saying, don't be harsh on this man. He has sacrificed so much for this country. So, let it not be a political witch hunt. To which Sardar Patel writes back saying, we're not doing a witch hunt. He'll be given the entire rope of justice and the course of law. But he ends it with this statement saying, legally he may get exonerated, but the moral albatross will hang on his neck all the time, which is again very problematic, where if you don't believe in the courts, and if legal exoneration also does not exonerate a person, morally everybody is culpable of so many crimes. So I think that becomes a problem. And in the 1970s, as you rightly said, when Indira Gandhi issued a stamp, said he was a byword of patriotism, his contribution to the struggle against the British is a separate chapter in the annals of Indian history and all of that. Didn't Indira Gandhi know that she was talking about a stooge, a collaborator, a traitor, Gandhi's assassin, an Islamophobe, and all kinds of adjectives? And why would she do that if she was doing that? I think no Congress person today would have an answer to that. I think the reason why she did it is, one is these tags are all false. The second reason is at that time, I think the Indian right or the Hindu right or whatever you want to call it, or the Hindutva parties were not a force to reckon with in the politics of India. The Jansangh was hardly existing. But the BJP had not even been born in the 1970s. And so the Congress could afford to be generous to one of their ideologues. But since the late 1990s, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government first dislodged the Congress, and the fact that they were unveiling a portrait of his in Central Hall of Parliament, putting a plaque in cellular jail, that probably shook the establishment. And from 2014 onwards, when the attempts are only more, it's a typical Congress attitude, where in Parliament you had someone none less than Mallikarjun Kharge, who in a answer to, I think, the Prime Minister said, even your dogs did not participate in the freedom struggle. So you really don't have any locus standi in the narrative of India. You did not participate in the freedom struggle. We are the ones who participated. We are the ones who are the rightful heirs to the throne of India. And so anybody else who's sitting there is a usurper. And so it's our bounden duty to throw you out and come there, as we are the natural leaders, because we have struggled, we have sacrificed. None of, even your dogs did not participate. So that sort of polarized view has come out today because of today's politics. Sadly, 2 generations before, Indira Gandhi did not see it that way. She was open enough. S.A. Dange and M.N. Roy, who were of the left parties, they used to call Savarkar as Comrade Savarkar, write eulogizing messages to him, letters to him.
We were in better times, and one could have actually a civil debate, even with your political opponent, without actually having to
name call,
to scream and do these things. That's indeed a good note to end on, because even with other freedom fighters that we have in our minds, someone like a Savarkar, who clearly had a very difficult childhood, was not born to privilege, and who really made a life for himself, and of course all the contributions. Whether you agree with him or not, sitting in the 21st century in your own cozy comfort, I think needs to be seen more in context. And I think context is what we will leave this evening's conversation with. And I thank you, and I thank the Times Literature Festival. It's been a pleasure being in conversation over this important topic.
Thank you, Vasanthi.